Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening.
Hello and welcome. This is Natasha Helfer, and we are here with a great panel. And with me, I've got a lot of great people. So we've got Michelle Peets from Salt Lake City area. Hi, Michelle.
Hello.
Got Ellege Alexander in the San Diego area. Hello, Ellen.
Hi.
And we've got Jenny Ellege from the Florida area. Hello.
Hello.
Although I always have to say, well, Jenny, you are also licensed in Utah.
I am.
So that's exciting. Yeah, and I'm licensed in where? Kansas, Wisconsin. And anyway, today we thought we'd touch on a bit of a more serious topic that we've been kind of noticing both in the news and the research and also kind of in our own experience with some of our clientele. And that is the topic of domestic violence, which is a heavy word. It's a heavy word. And I think like most words that have to do with abuse, it tends to come with like some baggage of what it means, you know? So I think as soon as you say the words domestic violence, you immediately maybe get some visuals of some stereotypes of what that might look like. And some of those stereotypes are true and actual. And some of them are not, because domestic violence actually covers a wide variety or spectrum of behaviors and dynamics that can happen in a couple or a family even, that can range from emotional, financial, physical, of course, and sexual types of dynamics. So it's not always kind of this, you know, category where you think of maybe somebody, you know, getting hit physically or, you know, having bruises on their bodies or things of that nature. So we want to make sure that we cover this topic widely, because otherwise, if you only have that perspective of it, then you can fall prey to not realizing that you are either in an abusive situation or that you are perpetuating abusive behaviors. So that's kind of how I'd like to start talking about it. But we're going to start off by just offering Michelle a little bit of kind of platform, because this is kind of an area of expertise that you have. So what would you like to start us off with as far as just kind of an introduction to the topic?
Sure. So yeah, I love how, Natasha, you pointed out all these other areas where abuse can happen in a relationship, because I think typically at Symmetry Solutions, we're not actually seeing a whole lot of the instances of physical violence. The part about physical violence is it's concrete, it's obvious. Usually people don't really debate. Like once somebody hits someone else, that's something that everyone's kind of aware of. Sometimes is even provable if there are things like bruises on the body. But there's this bigger piece that I think we see here at Symmetry, which is, more of the emotional and the verbal and the financial type of abuse. So the biggest thing I would start off with is just talking about power dynamics. Power dynamics can be really hard to sometimes recognize in couples because they show up in really subtle ways. So in a financial situation, for example, a couple could have a joint bank account, but there may still be way more influence on one person's part than another. And so while you may feel like things are equal, they may not actually be. Same with things like psychological abuse. A person who is abusive may not outright be verbally abusive and, telling their partner, you're a terrible person or you're not lovable, but they may be very subtly still cutting that person down. And so the thing to kind of, I think, keep in mind is that it may be hard to pinpoint abuse in your relationship because there aren't outright signs of it that you can kind of point to, which is why going to therapy or having another eye on it of somebody who's a trusted confidant is really helpful, because they may be able to point out these things that you yourself can't recognize.
That's right. Thank you for that. So one of the things that I think we've noticed, even just through this time of COVID, is the research saying that there has been an increase in kind of these domestic violence situations across the board in the United States, at least. And I would imagine that's probably global. That's probably a global finding. And that makes sense. I mean, we're all kind of more stressed. There's a lot of things going on where people are just kind of struggling, maybe financially, maybe emotionally. We're maybe more cooped up with each other than we have been in the past. We're having to spend more time with each other than we're accustomed to. Maybe there's less resources that we're able to access. We're not able to access maybe our friends as much as normal. So all of these things kind of mental health nor our relational health, right? So it can exacerbate the ways that we're coping, and it can exacerbate, of course, conflict in a relationship or family. Anybody want to address maybe anything else about that other than what I've said, or anything you've read around those lines, or have I said enough about that?
Sure. Also, don't fall into the, kind of the visual myth that this only occurs between heterosexual couples. This occurs with same-sex couples. It happens in non-monogamous relationships. No matter what your family looks like, it happens with family of choice. So no matter what your relationship looks like, all relationships are subject to the same stressors, and they can fall victim to the same weaknesses and problems. But the main thing is that if you recognize them, reach out, because there is help. And these external pressures that you have no control over, there is ways to really cope with those in a much more healthy way.
Yeah, abuse really survives and thrives in isolation. And so that, I think, is another big reason why we're seeing such an uptick right now during the pandemic, is because people are being forced to kind of stay in these pods or be pretty selective about who they surround themselves with. Some families may be, hesitant to bring in someone else who's kind of outside of their pod. And so to step outside of your actual household and trust that there is support elsewhere can feel really daunting, which is why we felt this was really important to bring up, is that there are resources outside your home, like therapy and telemental health and things like that, where you can get support even if you literally can't leave your home quite yet.
Okay, so let's talk about that, because I just did a training on telehealth a few months ago, and this is one of the things that we have noticed. Like, telehealth comes with pros and cons, right? So the huge pro is that there's now more access. It's easier to see somebody from the comfort of your own home. Like you said, if you don't have access to a car or to certain things, you can get on the computer and ask for help or get help. At the same time, one of the cons, I think, is limited privacy, right? So and in fact, this is kind of part of our informed consent at Symmetry, is that you are agreeing that when you come to see us through a telehealth medium, we don't have control over your level of confidentiality in your space, right? I have control over my space. I can make sure nobody's listening to our conversation because I'm in an office or in a private space, or I've got headphones on so nobody can overhear what you're telling me. But I don't know if you're in a space where you feel safe. I don't know if your partner is overhearing your conversation, or we've had several occasions now where we have had partners, either record or overhear or listen in on conversations that their spouse wasn't aware of. So that's a limitation of telehealth as well, and something that you should be aware of if you're in a situation where you're needing to be concerned about that. And I would say, I don't know, Jenny, if you're comfortable sharing maybe why this would be considered part of this power and control kind of abusive domestic violence behavior.
So you're probably going into your session assuming that you are having a private conversation between you and your therapist. And so if you find out or suspect that your partner, right, might be listening in or might have, recorded something, because in this day and age, there's lots of ways to make that happen. You're setting up this power dynamic between you and your partner that indicates that I don't trust you and you are not a trustworthy person. And so that's problematic, right? Because we are our own individual people who deserve our own privacy, which is a little bit different than secrecy type of thing. So you and your partner need to be probably having ongoing conversations about what you consider to be private versus secret behavior.
Can you talk about this maybe a little bit, any of you, as far as sometimes people feel like they have the right to breach privacy? Like in some of my cases where this has happened, it's because people are afraid that maybe somebody is being unfaithful in some sort of way, or that they're hiding information about finances, or that they're hiding information about their own children, right? Or that they're hiding information about plans for divorce, right? And so a lot of times people are doing these kinds of behaviors because they're afraid of something, right? That their partner isn't being truthful to them about. I think, Alan, you had used the language moral high ground, in our provider meeting. Like sometimes we feel like we have a moral high ground to, and in a sense, act badly because there's like a better there's a good reason to act badly, if that makes sense. So how can we like think through why that's still not necessarily a great moral standing?
Well, don't let your best of intentions get the better of you, because you got to remember that some of these actions could actually be illegal and open you up to criminal liability. Not only that, but if you're the partner or a member of a relationship that is really hoping that the other partner or members of your relationship is getting the help they need, you can actually irreparably damage that relationship and actually sabotage their ability to really work on your relationship and try and make it healthier. So it can really be counterproductive in several ways.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. Okay. Michelle, do we want to kind of go through some of I know that like it's a very common resource that I think is really helpful, is the power and dynamic wheel. Is that something that you want to kind of at least educate people on where they can find that and what's on that to help people understand better some of these concepts that we're talking about?
Yeah, sure. So the most straightforward place to look for this is called the Duluth model. They're the ones who've been studying power and control dynamics for decades now. And so you can literally just Google Duluth model. That's DULUTH, Duluth. And they'll show you multiple different wheels, one of them being the power and control wheel, it shows all the different ways that power dynamics are used in order to control one person. So it'll have things on there like financial control that we mentioned earlier. So maybe limiting your partner from any access to bank accounts. It has control of children. So sometimes manipulating the children or getting them to believe, that their partner is a terrible person. It has emotional control on there, things like verbal abuse, where you're putting your partner down and making them feel small or unimportant or incapable of leaving the relationship. And then atop of all those different things can be sexual and physical violence. Those things don't necessarily always occur in abusive relationships. All of this has now been complicated by a rising number of queer relationships that we're seeing. And Alan hit on this earlier, but the Duluth model for a long time was conceptualized as kind of a gendered thing. Domestic violence was gendered. It was males beating their female romantic partners. Now that they're doing more research and looking at queer relationships, they're realizing there actually doesn't always seem to be this stereotype. especially now that we're looking more carefully at other forms of abuse like verbal, psychological, and emotional, and even sexual violence and abuse. We're finding that that can kind of go either which way. And so it's really helpful to kind of keep in mind that power, while we often think of it as a physical thing, like if you can kind of outmaneuver someone or be stronger than someone else, you can kind of like beat them into submission. Power and control are actually way more subtle than that. There's a lot of power and control that is sustained in just within our minds and through strategy and through our emotions. And we actually see a whole lot more of that happening than we ever see of kind of the physical violence. So the other thing that I would add about the power and control wheel is that typically what you see is that partners who want to maintain control over their partners will do so in these psychological ways, and then they won't turn to violence unless the psychological means aren't working anymore. So as soon as they kind of perceive that their partner is kind of wisening up and catching on to their methods, then they'll turn to the physical violence. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. If you're somebody who is waking up to some of these more subtle forms of control, you are at the height of your danger typically when you're waking up to those things, and then your partner is realizing that you're waking up to them. And so you want to be really careful with that process, especially if you're in a relationship where you're kind of used to being really open with your partner. And so back to Jenny's point about privacy, sometimes it's really important to maintain your privacy as you're talking about these really, really sensitive topics and awakening to them yourself.
Yeah, and I think it's important also to know that it is, although it is not a gendered issue, domestic violence, obviously, at the same time, male to female violence is probably the most deadly, right? And so that's where the issue is gendered, usually, in regards to how many people we lose to domestic violence from a murder standpoint in that regard on a yearly basis. So that's very difficult. But yes, from an emotional perspective, a psychological perspective, I think that's more equal territory as far as we're all capable of those kinds of tactics. And when you look at the power and control wheel, I think if we're all going to be fairly humble, I think, you know, it's good to look at those things and say, well, when we're fighting, when we're defensive, when we're, you know, in these spaces, maybe those are some of the things that we do. We have to start looking at those things in our regards to how we self-regulate and how we self-manage. And that's something that I think is good to consider. I think, again, it's not healthy to think of ththese things as black and white, right? Like, oh, you either are or you're not. Oh, only those people are abusers. I would never be that. You know, it's because then it makes it so it's like this horrible thing to kind of have to admit to, instead of all of us seeing it more as a spectrum. And it's like, where am I on that spectrum and where can I get better, so that we're avoiding these kinds of tactics. And some of these tactics, quite frankly, come from intergenerational patterns of how we've been taught to deal with conflict, which come a lot of times with how we've been taught to deal with patriarchy, male privilege, sometimes the strategies, especially as women, of dealing with the oppression of male privilege. So sometimes the psychological and verbal aspects of abuse for women are a power play against some of the oppression of male privilege. So it's a very complex kind of thing. So I would encourage everybody to look at that from a perspective of like, am I a victim of some of these things? And am I also sometimes using some of these tactics myself? And I think that's a healthy way to approach these wheels. I also would like to say that if you are in a relationship where you are considering separation and or divorce, and these things are definitely in place, that is when you are at most danger for physical violence, and where you really want to have protective factors for yourself and for your children, and where contacting a domestic violence shelter and or resources or professionals who specialize in these areas is the wisest kind of route to go, And many of these spaces have really good confidential means of keeping your privacy safe, even the fact that you've contacted them altogether. In fact, some of these spaces, like even if you search them on the web, will have ways that you can't really show that you've searched for them. So they try to protect your confidentiality as much as possible. The last thing I wanted to talk about is a dynamic we were talking about today. A lot of times when people are in abusive situations, long-term kind of ongoing chronic abusive situations in a couple, one person may reach a point where they will do something that is considered morally incorrect. For example, an affair, or leaving for a certain amount of time, like I'm out of here for a certain amount of time, even, maybe even abandoning the family for 6 months or something along those lines. And then they come back or something along those lines. And then the person who's kind of been the abuser, all along, in a sense, has even more moral high ground. So in other words, there's been this kind of abuse that's worn down this one person. This one person is like worn down. They react by doing something that we deem incorrect in society, right? So they go have an affair, they go, off, they spend a bunch of money, they do something that's just something bad, they go on a drinking binge, something like that. And then when they come back trying to repair that, now the person who's kind of been chronically abusing things is like, see, now you're the bad person. And now they can abuse even more. So who wants to kind of tease this out a little bit? Who wants to talk about this even better than what I'm talking about, these dynamics?
Yeah, I mean, being able to, okay, so absent, powered dynamics in a healthy relationship, ideally you want to have, enough emotional regulation so that when you're in conflict with your partner, you're not acting in abusive ways. And then secondly, part of a healthy relationship is to be able to do repairs, because we mess up with people. Sometimes we get escalated, and sometimes we do things a little bit outside of our character that we would normally do when we're fairly calm. So you add the abuse that's already kind of happening in your relationship. And like Natasha said earlier, it doesn't have to be an always thing. It can be a sometime thing. It could be really visible when you're in high conflict with each other too. So when you start doing that, the repair part is really important to be. That's like the second, most important thing, to try to avoid getting too escalated to begin with. But if you do, you have to be able to develop those skills to allow for repair to happen. And that repair is a very egalitarian type of relationship that both partners have to agree to engage in. One has to offer, and one also has to receive it in a fairly equal way.
Yeah, and I would like to add that there's no shaming going on here. We're not trying to say that if you are a person who's engaging in any of these dynamics, that there's any shame in what you're doing. We learn these from observation of how our parents or other family members have handled conflict, or what we see in society. And even if you've experienced perhaps your own trauma, you've developed skills that were protective of you in the first place, like anger, throw up an anger wall or whatever. But then when you enter into healthy relationships, that's no longer protective. It's actually destructive. It's counterproductive. So we're not here to shame anybody. We're just here to educate. And if you're interested in changing those dynamics, in learning new skills, and in breaking unhealthy interactional patterns, that's when we really encourage you to reach out and get help, because we all learn things that didn't serve us well in the past, and they get carried forward, and they're really not serving any healthy function now. They may have been protective at some point, but we human beings, our brains are wired to go with what works, and we develop habits extremely easily. So it's easy to go with what you know, even if it's not really helping you.
I love what you're saying, and I'll piggyback off of that. I've had clients who've come in and they say things like, I'm a people pleaser. I think I've been walked all over my whole life. How do I create boundaries? How do I kind of reestablish more of that egalitarian relationship with the people around me? I've also had clients come in and say, I think I'm a little, power hungry, or I'm a little controlling. How do I step back and maybe let other people have their own autonomy? And then I've seen that happen in couples as well, where they come in and there are kind of those dynamics on a way less extreme level than what we've been talking about today, where one person's maybe just a little more assertive, the other person is more of a placater. How can we kind of fix that dynamic so it is more equal? And so we do see this a lot. And I think to your point, Ellen, like these are things that we learn in our families. We develop certain patterns just to survive, whatever that looks like. And so therapy is a great place to be able to talk through that and figure out, okay, why did I do those things? And we're really here to just kind of help you maybe understand that and then start to push against what your natural inclinations once were. So I think the big takeaway from this whole thing is that, yes, we do want to call out abuse, and we do want to not leave any room, to excuse things like violence, but we also really want to work within the means that we have. And if people are wanting to change, that's absolutely what we're here for.
And I think especially in kind of the examples that I'm talking about, if you're the person who's, gone and done something to breach the marriage, like an affair or, an abandonment or something like that, and then you're coming back in a typical relationship, you're kind of having to do some repair work. Obviously you're having to kind of, apologize and kind of be in the doghouse for a minute, right? and kind of, do that work to rebuild trust and see if the other person is still willing to kind of work with you and repair through that betrayal. My concern is that if there was a lot of domestic violence ahead of that betrayal, that when that person comes back, that person who's more used to using abusive tactics will then up those abusive tactics, right? And now this person is like acquiescing to things that are more than needed in a typical repair, right? And like having to really acquiesce more than is necessary to the point of self-harm, more than is needed in repairing a relationship, if I'm making myself clear. So that's where I want couples to be aware that yes, repair is necessary when somebody has breached a contract. At the same time, abuses is also a breach of contract and can lead to disruption in a relationship, and people need to take responsibility for that as well. You can't just only take responsibility for the results of unhappy dynamics that are leading to bigger issues in the relationship. So that's a complicated thing, right? That's a complicated dance to know when those things are happening. But hopefully a skilled, therapist would be able to help you see how much of that is in balance in the repair process so that it's not out of balance in a way that would be hurtful to either party. All right, lots of things. This is a complicated subject. We're just trying to give you some basic ideas, some basic strategies. And I would say, one last thing that I would say is that I think is important is if you are, dealing with things that you're concerned about, where your partner has breached your level of trust, it is important, even if you never use it, to document these things so that you can remember. So you can remember this happened on this day. Maybe my partner locked me out of my account on this particular day. My partner did leave a bruise on me this particular day. Even those things are important to even document, maybe with a photograph. If you're not willing to go in and get medical attention, maybe at least take a documentation for yourself. If a partner has verbally assaulted you, by calling you really horrible names or things like that, put it down in a document where you date it and you just state very factually what happened. You may never use it, but if you do need to kind of have recollection of what happened and examples to back up your stories, because a lot of times you doubt yourself, and you're like, did that really happen? Or was it as bad as I thought? Or maybe I was just making a bigger deal than, I think it should have been. You have those examples in place. And then in our system, so like when we have clients, we have a portal, right? So we have a client portal that actually has a journal, so people can go in and very confidentially write those kinds of things down. And only the person who has access to our portal can access that. So that's a very confidential way to keep a document like that. So if you can find ways to keep that in a confidential, safe place where somebody can't just rip up that document or get rid of it, or so that would be kind of my last thought about protecting yourself. Any other thoughts in regards to little tips or tricks like that? Okay. Thank you, Jenny and Ellen. I know Michelle had to run for a session. So for those of you who have joined us, we hope you've enjoyed this. Take care, everybody. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Unknown ways before me roll, hiding rock and treacherous show. Chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
As a mother stills her child, thou canst hush the ocean wild, wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
Boisterous wave, obey thy will.
Obey thy will.
When thou sayest to them,
Be still.
wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. When at last I near the shore, and the fearful breakers roar, may I hear thee say to me, fear not, I will pilot thee. Twixt me and the peaceful rest,
The peaceful rest.
then while